Hey, y'all. So, this chat is actually the thing that I think most people come to me for. So, if you don't know, I'm a consultant. I help people build businesses that are successful, that are profitable, that last, and that are sustainable. I've been doing this forever. And I got into this work, in corporate America because I have always been curious about money. And when I say people come to me about this, a lot of people are drawn to my work or, hire me because they're like, Nicole, you have a very interesting relationship with the dollar. And I want to talk to you about your relationship with money. I want to talk to you about how you feel about it, how you feel it impacts your life, how you feel it limits you, and above all else, just kind of share a little bit about what I think could really transform things. Now, this conversation is particularly important right now because I think a lot of families, a lot of people are feeling the pinch. Economically, things aren't as easy as they used to be. It's rare that we're in a situation financially in this world where prices of things are going up and people are losing their jobs, right? Usually in recessions and things of that sort, people may be experiencing layoffs or, there may be, difficulties in the job market, but at the same time, prices are stable, things aren't crazy expensive. Well, this is kind of like a double whammy. And I think a lot of us, no matter where you are financially, are having to confront what we think about money, what's important to us, what our priorities are, what do we want to sacrifice as we have to choose between summer camp and keeping the kids at home or paying for those extra meals out and ordering in or, going to your local big box store and saying, "Hey, I'm gonna buy in bulk because we gotta stretch the dollar a little further." Well, growing up for me, I didn't have that choice. I didn't even have the choice of will I get the nice thing because I was sleeping on a couch until I was 12. My dad was a cab driver, and money for me always took the form of cash, meaning what I saw is what we had. My dad would go work all day, and I remember he would come home and he would have just these wads of money, and he kept them in his shirt pocket. He'd kinda, like, fold it and stick it in his shirt pocket. He wasn't like a wallet carrier, and he just was always dealing with cash because back in the, I'm gonna date myself here, but the late '80s, early '90s in DC, you paid cab drivers in cash. That was how that worked. There was no Uber. There was no Venmo, and people didn't use credit cards readily. So, you got into the car, you paid your fare, once you were dropped off, and then my dad lived and fed our family off of what he had in hand at the end of every day. So, growing up, I always had a very highly visual and present reminder around our sustenance, around whether or not we could thrive, around what we'd be able to do, and that was represented by sort of the thickness, or the flatness of this wad that was right over his heart, and what was interesting was that money was constantly discussed in my home. I remember going with my dad to pay rent, and rent again was paid in cash. We lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in Washington, D.C. And like I said, I slept on a couch in the living room. And, my younger sister slept on a twin bed while my parents had, their bed, in that one bedroom. And every single month, late, right? Never by the first, usually before the 15th, we would take a trip down to visit Mr. Bernstein. Now, if you're from the DC area, you may recognize that name. Mr. Bernstein owned, or Bernstein Companies owned, a series of different apartment buildings in the DC area through the 80s and 90s. And they're a very wealthy, well known family in the area. And I don't know them personally in the context of I don't even think they know who I am or, anything like that, but I remember Mr. Bernstein, who has long since, passed, because my dad would go in to his offices in the Chevy Chase, Bethesda, Maryland area, which is like a, wealthy area, and, he would go in, and I remember him begging every single month, you know, "Mr. Bernstein, I have something to put on rent," and I think at the time, back then our rent was probably something like, I wanna say like 6 or $700, and it kinda stayed that way for a while until I think it went up to like 1,100 by the time we ended up moving, after my dad stayed there for, I wanna say my dad was in that apartment building because he lived there first and then he grew his family there, he came there as an immigrant, lived there first. He was probably there for like 30 years. So, you know, I remember us going in there and my dad saying like, "Mr. Bernstein, I have 400 to give you now in cash," and kind of counting out that money. "And I promise I'll bring you the rest before the end of the month." And, I think a lot of us we hear about the housing market and our kids are kind of entering the world, we know it's not like that now, right? Like, if you're lucky, you have a landlord that you could probably even talk to or that has the flexibility to say, you know, bring me the rest later or don't worry about this now. But like times just aren't like that. Everything's digital, everything's automated. People don't have relationships like they used to. You just pay that rent. And if you don't, everything's automated and you may be getting evicted, right? Like that's just how it goes. Everything's virtual. But back then in the olden times, you know, you could walk in and, your landlord had a face and you knew them and you paid in cash and they had a choice around how they wanted to treat you. And, we made that trip down to Mr. Bernstein's office more often than not. There was many an occasion where I knew that, my dad was sort of shifting money around to cover the bills. So if the utilities came in a little high, that meant that we needed a little more time. He would have to drive more shifts, if something came up where he was either sick or had a cold or something that took him out for a couple days, that meant that we didn't have money for a few days. So we were short, so maybe he would have to work harder at the end of the month to add that in to make rent, and so in any case, I had a lot of memories of every single month wondering if we would have enough for rent to make it down to Mr. Bernstein's office or if Mr. Bernstein would continue to show us the grace and kindness of, giving us a little extra time, as a family to come up with it. And he always did. So, if his family's hearing this or if it makes its way back down, to him, he was always a very good man and I'm very grateful, for how Mr. Bernstein showed up in our life and giving us that flexibility and grace, because it kept this girl housed and it kept our family housed, where we might not have been able to. But it also meant that I had a really direct relationship around my basic core needs being met and whether or not we had money. And it didn't just extend to things like a roof over my head. And I think some of these stories may relate to you as well, but it also extended to grocery shopping. I remember going grocery shopping with my mom, and we went to BJ's, wholesale club, which, for those of you Costco shoppers or Sam's Club shoppers, if you're an East Coaster, BJ's wholesale club is kind of like, our answer to that sort of thing. And I remember going and my mom making a very tight list, and we went every 2 weeks, and we restocked on everything from, you know, tomatoes, because she made a lot of African soups, to, canned goods, to fresh meats and fish, to laundry detergent. I mean, every single thing we got, we were picking it up for that 2 weeks, and there were no midweek trips, and there was no quick running to the store, and there was no snacks. There were no, quick stops and dining in, and we ordered a pizza probably like twice a year, and that was a big deal. So, going to the grocery store always was exciting for me because I always remember that we were waiting for a paycheck to come in so that we could restock. But it was exciting for me because those last couple days before grocery shopping, I could see the back of our fridge. Now, if you have grown up in a home that's pretty well to do, or if you've never known food insecurity, which is a different category of not having food at all, right? It's not, what I think a lot of us identify with not having enough. Food insecurity is, we just don't know if we'll have enough to make it, or no one's ever eating all the way the right amount. And we definitely don't have like options, right? So growing up, I remember seeing the back of my fridge because my fridge wasn't all the way full. And after grocery shopping, I remember being super excited that Saturday morning, or if we went on Saturday, that Sunday, to open up the fridge and see how full it was, because I knew I would have options and I knew I would have choices. And I knew that if I wanted to maybe, have scrambled eggs for breakfast, we had scrambled eggs. But if I wanted to have cereal, we had milk, but it was all dependent on how much money we had. And if we made it to that register and we didn't have enough, things went back because we could only work with what we have. And a lot of Americans and a lot of people I think are living like this today. Some of you listening right now don't know any different. And some of you are really blessed because you have no idea what I'm talking about. But as somebody who is in a rare and blessed place to say that I have not only known food insecurity and known past tense, thank you God, but I also know the 1%. I'm also aware of how the trauma of poverty can impact you. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk enough about how there is a PTSD traumatic effect that seeps into various areas of our life if we grew up without. And we say that in reference to growing up without, love. And we say that to growing up without education, that we can sort of see the down the line impact. But growing up without money, you better believe that there is a PTSD impact where it continues to affect you in a post traumatic way and dictates your decisions and your responses and the way you feel about money. And what's interesting, I think, about how I interact with money is I still feel anxiety, right? If I'm worried that I won't make a bill, I still feel worried about if I'll have enough or if I'll be able to do all the things or kind of keep things going, like that sort of rug getting pulled out from underneath you. But I don't ever worry about my ability to get it. I've never actually bought into, the societal lie that money is apart from me or something I cannot have or something I do not deserve. And I think that conversation is just now starting to sort of enter our world where people are saying like money mindset and do you believe in it? Are you manifesting? I think we're just now starting to really make that popular culture and conversation. But I want to let you know that for some of us, it's deeper than that, right? It's not just that you don't believe you deserve the money enough, right? It's not that you just have a relationship with it where you don't think you deserve. You may actually have trauma that is the reason why you have a weird relationship with money. If you grew up seeing the back of your fridge, it is directly tied to your needs being met. So obviously, you may have a little bit of a strange relationship with it. And what I find whenever my clients hear me talk about money is I get a couple of different responses. I'll never forget when I first started consulting after being a blogger for years, I actually had some people who had money issues, right? Money trauma, money mindset, poverty issues, PTSD, where they would say to me, the way that I talk about money must mean that I am cocky or full of myself or all you care about is money, right? Like as if I did not value anything else or would be willing to sell out for a dollar. And what's interesting is anyone who knows me, right, personally, anyone who's in my life, anyone who's a friend of mine knows that my relationship with money is I truly am fluid with it, right? I really believe it's an ecosystem. What goes out comes back to me. And I would never in a million years sell out a relationship for a dollar. Like it just does not matter to me enough. And how I got that way, I think, is that as I was trying to figure out why my fridge was empty and my friends had pantries filled with snack options, why, my mom was foregoing buying a winter coat so that I could go on a field trip with my class, why my friends had, entire wings of their house. I went to DC private school. So, people, my friends lived very well, like entire wings of their house, with their own bathroom and nannies and drivers, and I was, home by myself taking care of my sister because my dad had to go back to work and my mom didn't get back until later because she had a long commute. Like what was going on here? I always had an approach of curiosity in my mind, and I never had an approach of deserving or worth when it came to money. And if there's anything I can extend to you, it's that. Growing up, I just realized that money gave people more options. It wasn't that I had no snacks, it was that they had not just snacks, but they had more options. And what I desired was choice. And we all deserve to have choice, right? We deserve to be in a position where we're able to say to ourselves, not just, do I have the choice of feed my kids or not, but I have a choice around what I feed them. And a lot of times we lose sight of the fact that money is that barrier between it. Oftentimes, the people who are living a certain quality of life, particularly if they're teaching us online, saying, or speaking about their lives online, saying, you should be doing this in terms of, dietary choices or educational choices or whatever else. A lot of times they're afforded a place where their financial background has given them extra choice, and a lot of those people in that situation may not acknowledge that not everyone has grown up with that choice. And even if they're in a financial position where they can make a different choice, the trauma of being impoverished may keep them from making those choices. So, another example, I don't think my little one will mind me saying this, but one of my daughters, is on her own, right? Like you guys know, I have a bunch of grown kids that I adopted. So I've got my 26-year-old, my 23-year-old, my 13-year-old, and then now Josie, my 4-month-old. And one of my daughters, when she's on, I shouldn't even say one of my daughters, all of my daughters, except for maybe my 13-year-old, Once they re-entered the world and they weren't under the structure of living with mom and they had choice around where they would spend their money, I wanna be clear, they grew up, spent the majority of their formative years living in a home that was a $1,000,000 home with a mother who worked and was highly educated without having a need that wasn't met, having access to the best schools, posting 4.0s, even though they grew up and spent for both of my oldest girls over a decade, with their biological mom living in deep poverty and, being initially exposed to limited options. I mean, eating meals of bags of chips, eating meals of, gosh, skipping meals, I mean, is really the honest, perspective. I mean, really growing up without food, to the point where, some of my daughters have shared with me that they thought they didn't like food for the longest time because food was always so processed or it was, sometimes spoiled, like what they received just, they were living off of the last of the scraps. And so they would opt not to eat because they're like, we just don't like food. But now you would think, right, after growing up and experiencing a life where, I cooked meals, fresh meals where they've eaten, I mean, everything from like, my girls will say like, oh, we prefer mac and cheese with truffles in it. Like this is like where, trust me, people acclimate and adjust to nice life really quickly, right? Very, very quickly. It's amazing how the kids can acclimate. So, they've grown up and they've lived this life where they know better, right? They know better. They know what's good for them. They know what's healthy. They know the importance of vegetables and fresh things. And they're in a financial position now as older kids, to be able to make that choice. But they don't. They don't. When I see my girls and, we go out there eating chicken fingers and fries, and some of that is obviously they're in their 20s, like, look, they just want a slice of pizza. But some of it is the trauma of poverty. It's that their relationship with money, their relationship with lifestyle really has been so severely impacted on a grassroots ground cellular level when they first grew up that their choices are ingrained in them and they have to actively work to come out of this mindset in order to do something different even though their circumstances have changed. Now, I always want to, acknowledge that not everybody has the financial ability, wherewithal, funds, to even make the choice, right? Even if they desire to do better, they just are the circumstances and the systemic racism and privilege based situations and, you know, government, administrative things have kept it so that they could never, right? If you live in a food desert, and I know some people aren't familiar with that term, but if you live in a situation where the closest grocery store is 20 miles away and you do not have a car, then yes, you are shopping for your groceries at the local gas station. And that means you're not getting fresh goods. That is a real thing and a very real experience for a lot of Americans. I am not making that up as a hypothetical, right? You can Google it, food desert. But that being said, if you aren't in that situation anymore, a lot of people will criticize and say, why aren't you making different choices? And it's because we're not acknowledging that growing up without money is a form of trauma, that can really inform your life. And that trauma doesn't have to be so big as, um, we slept outside, we were always evicted. It can be as simple as I really remember not having enough, and that extends to even being, middle class, or being in a situation where you recognize a lot of your peers were experiencing a different type of life than what you experienced because you just didn't have that at home. And so I think it's important for all of us because I think most of us fit into that category, right? Most of us did not grow up in a 1% gilded golden lifestyle where all of our needs were met financially, where where money wasn't a conversation in the home because our parents, were so well to do that it wasn't even a thought, and if we are in a place where we grew up in this certain way, we really have to examine what is our relationship with money? What judgments do we put on others when we think that they have it? What do we think money means about me and means about others? Because like I said, I had this person come up to me, once I finally started doing consulting work and they had known me in a previous life before that maybe hadn't been so money focused or money elevated where I was talking about it online. And they actually said to me, like, all you care about is money. And immediately I was like, "Oh, that's on you." I shouldn't say that. First, I was like, "Oh my gosh, is that really how I come off? Do I really come off as all I care about is money?" But then I realized like, no, that's their junk, right? Because anyone who knows me knows that's not all I care about. What I care about is that money affords me options. And I hope that I extend that to you as well. As you explore your relationship with money and the things that you believe about people who have money that you recognize that are you believing some of those things? One, because of their character and what they're showing, because make no mistake, there are some trash ass billionaires out there, right? Ain't no reason. Ain't no reason for you to have all that money and not give it away, not help people, not support people, or worse, use that money to cause active harm or continue to collect that money behind doing harm, right? So make no mistake, we are not wrong to sit here and say eat the rich in some circumstances, okay? Because that is absolutely true. But if you're looking at someone who just seems to be slightly better off than you are, and you're saying to yourself, well, there must be something fundamentally wrong with them because they have this money or they've acquired this money, rather than you saying, well, what could I have learned? Or is there something here? Or, are they that different from me? What is the gap here between what they may have that has afforded them these options versus what I may need in order to have these options, and where do I go to get them? Because that is my fundamental approach. Like, completely transparently, I do not look at anybody on this planet and say, "Okay, they have something that I can't do." That's actually not true. Simone Biles. Okay, I'm gonna just be Simone Biles, Serena Williams, Beyonce. There are some people that I do look at and I say, "Okay, they may be a bit out of reach." All right? Like, that may not be in my wheelhouse, that may not be my ministry. I need to let them have it, right? Okay, but for the most part, when it comes to something financial, and I look at someone who's wealthy, I say to myself, "Well, what did they do? What are the steps? Am I able to do those things? And also, am I willing to do those things?" I've talked kind of briefly before about how, I used to say, in my early 30s that I was shooting for billionaire status, right? I was shooting for multi nine figuraire, that was what I was going for. And as I've gotten older and I've looked at both my health, my actual lifestyle, right? Like, what is it that I even really want? What am I gonna do with all that money, right? Like, my family, and I've also looked and examined what working on a certain level has cost me. I have really come to say to myself, "You know what? I would be really good with enough," right? Enough and a smidge extra, right? I wanna make sure that everything is covered. I wanna make sure I leave a nice inheritance. I wanna have money to be able to solve some problems. Philanthropic work is really at the heart of a lot of what I do. People don't know how deep I am in the philanthropic world, but that is big to me. I wanna be able to write checks and solve problems without bureaucracy. So I want enough to do that. But ultimately, I just wanna always feel like I'm not limited in my choices. And whatever amount of money affords me that life is enough for me, and that is not, I don't need the choice of whether or not I can get away with a crime because I can, buy off a entire political administration. I don't need to know if I can get away with, or my children can do things and I can just, write them a check to make it all disappear. No, I want my children to absorb the full weight of their consequences, and know that they have to make good choices to get outcomes they desire. I don't need money to erase things, but I do want to know that if my daughter shows an aptitude for a certain talent, that I'm able to pay to nurture that talent as required. Or that if our family wants to spend more time together, that I'm able to take time off to be able to be where I'm supposed to be. These are things that do matter to me. And money gives you options. And if there's one thing that I want to just send home with you, as you explore, what are my first beliefs around money? What are my first, exposures to money? Even if it was stuff like knowing your parents had the money, but they were always like, we don't got it, like that probably made an imprint on your mind. And as you're looking around and saying, what do I believe about some of the people that I see with money? That they had to do something wrong, that they harm is that true? Because it may be, or is it that I need to explore why I think that about them without any substance behind it, you know? What do I feel about my own limitation? As you start exploring some of these questions, because I really do think it's going to be a unlocking, in some of these conversations, some of the content you may see that I put out, or for some of you who may be saying to yourself, I want to build a business, or I want to grow my business, or I have something that's entrepreneurial at my heart, and I would love to work with Nicole to figure that out, which if you do, NicoleWalters.com, I'm happy to help you. But as you start exploring, which is sort of the assignment of today, your relationship with money, I want to let you know this little poor girl, who grew up in DC and really didn't have it and wasn't sure every month if she would have a roof over her head, was able to get where she is today because I knew, if nothing else, that there were really bad people out there who had money, really horrible, terrible people who had no blocks whatsoever about getting all the money in the world so they could have the option of doing terrible things with it. I think we all can agree with that. And if those people are saying to themselves without option, without hesitation, that they're going to go out there and get that they're entitled to all the money in the world to advance their own interest, then you, as a good person, as someone who cares to take care of your family, that wants to change the world and push it in the right direction and help others and solve things and let other people get seen. Don't you have a right to pursue it as well? Don't you deserve choices in this world? Absolutely. So, clear your blocks out. Figure out what is standing in the way of you becoming and being and getting everything you actually deserve. And then go get it.